August 19, 1960. High over the Pacific Ocean, a turboprop transport plane chugs through thin cloud. Below it, at about 2,600 meters, 8,500 feet, an orange parachute sways gently, supporting a golden capsule roughly the size of a kettle drum. Captain Harold Mitchell eases his lumbering C-119J flying boxcar to around 220 km/h, 120 knots. The crew grips their seats as a boom operator leans out the back with a long hooked pole. On the third pass, the hook catches the parachute's line. The capsule lurches, then begins trailing behind the aircraft like a caught fish. They reel it in fast. The metal drum they haul aboard is still warm from re-entry, paint blistered and smelling of scorched lacquer. Inside lies 914 meters, 3,000 feet, of tightly wound photographic film. Freshly exposed images of forbidden Soviet territory. Washington has just snatched a glimpse behind the Iron Curtain from 160 kilometers, 100 miles above. Moscow had laughed off American spy-in-the-sky schemes for years. Until now. Before the pictures, it's early 1960, and the United States is suddenly flying blind over the Soviet Union. For 4 years, U-2 spy planes crisscrossed Soviet skies at 21,000 meters, 70,000 feet, snapping photos of airfields and missile sites with impunity. But on May 1, 1960, a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers is shot down near Sverdlovsk. The pilot survives and is captured. A furious President Eisenhower halts all U-2 overflights. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev thunders in public about the gross violation of his airspace, then privately crows that the Americans have lost their eyes over his territory. U.S. intelligence gathering is cut off cold, and Cold War fears begin to spike. Politicians in Washington warn of a looming missile gap, convinced the USSR has more ICBMs hidden in its vast interior than the U.S. can match. The Air Force imagines swarms of Soviet bombers massing just beyond the horizon, but the hard truth is simple: no one knows for sure. In Moscow, officials scoff that American satellites can't possibly spy effectively from orbit, and that if they try, it would be illegal anyway. Soviet diplomats even urged the United Nations to ban espionage from space in late 1960. The Kremlin's message is a confident dismissal. Let the foolish Yankees fling cameras into orbit. They won't see anything useful. Washington, however, is desperate for answers. If manned flights are too risky now, maybe machines can do the job. The stage is set for an audacious technological gamble. The machine project Corona is that gamble, a top-secret U.S. program to reconnoiter the USSR from orbit using an unmanned camera satellite. The idea sounds straightforward. Put a camera in space, take pictures from above, and somehow get the film back to Earth. In 1960, however, that's a high-wire act of engineering. This is an era when a computer weighs as much as a car, and digital imaging is science fiction. So Corona must rely on actual photographic film and ingenious mechanics. A Thor Agena rocket launches the first Corona satellite into low Earth orbit, about 160 kilometers up. At that altitude, it circles the planet every 90 minutes at a blistering 28,000 km/h. On board, a specially designed camera peers downward through a 61 cm 24-inch lens, essentially a telescope aimed at the Earth. As the satellite hurtles over Soviet territory, the camera automatically sweeps back and forth to capture a broad strip of ground below, to counteract motion blur from moving roughly 8 kilometers per second, 5 miles per second. The lens assembly actually rotates opposite the direction of flight. The result, despite the tremendous speed, swaths of the motherland steadily imprint themselves onto 70mm film inside the satellite. One Corona satellite carries up to about 4,900 meters, 16,000 feet of this thin film, spooled like a giant reel of movie tape. But there's no radio link capable of sending photographs down. In 1960, the only way to retrieve images is to physically recover the film. And here's the wild part. The satellite doesn't gently land its precious cargo with engines or a steerable capsule. It simply drops it. At the end of a mission, the Corona craft ejects a film bucket, a squat, gold-plated return capsule, on a carefully timed trajectory back to Earth. A small retro rocket kicks the bucket out of orbit, and it plummets through the atmosphere, protected by an ablative heat shield as it blazes a fiery path home. Over the Pacific, at about 18,000 meters, 60,000 feet, A parachute deploys from the tumbling bucket to slow its fall. Instead of letting it drift into the ocean, the U.S. Air Force snatches it in midair. Special recovery planes trail long hooks to snag the parachute's lines. It's like threading a needle at 200 km/h, 124 mph in the sky. If the first attempt misses, the pilots circle around and try again. In our cold open scene, the capsule codenamed Discoverer 14 becomes the first ever caught on the fly. Inside that captured bucket is the prize. Kilometers of film packed with secrets no human eyes have seen. The whole system is part rocket science, part carnival stunt. And against the odds, it works. The skeptics in Moscow won't be smiling for long. First frames, first shots in a windowless lab in Maryland. Fresh off the recovery plane, the reels of Corona film are developed and hung up to dry. By late August 1960, analysts at the new National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, crowd around glowing light tables. They gingerly unspool the first frames and stare in disbelief. Grainy or not, these images reveal what 2 generations of spies and defectors could only guess at. Entire airfields sprawl across the negatives. Document says, it was as if an enormous floodlight had been turned on in a darkened warehouse. All at once, huge swaths of the USSR that had been blank spaces on the map come into focus. One photo shows a Soviet bomber airfield that Western intelligence had never even pinned down before. The telltale silhouettes of 295 Bear long-range bombers, each with a 50-meter wingspan, 164 feet, stand out clearly on the tarmac. The analysts count them, perhaps a dozen Bears parked in plain view. Another image captures a remote missile test range in Central Asia. On it, they spot 2, maybe 3 launch pads with service gantries, likely for the giant R-7 Semyorka ICBM. Not 20 launch pads. Not 50. Just a handful. A realization ripples through the room. The so-called missile gap is an illusion. American experts had warned that the Soviets might deploy 100 or even 200 ICBMs by 1961. But Corona's photos tell a very different story. The first missions find only a few operational ICBM launch sites, literally countable on one hand, and no evidence of hundreds more hidden elsewhere. The vaunted Soviet arsenal suddenly looks like a much smaller, targetable set of assets. Surprises appear in kind and in number. At a large airfield near Orenburg, one frame shows rows of Mys Shmidta M4 Bison jet bombers. Analysts note that there are fewer Bisons than feared, and many are parked wingtip to wingtip out in the open, rather than dispersed under camouflage. In another photo at a base in Ukraine, dozens of fighter planes sit lined up along a taxiway under what look like canvas covers. Are they being prepared for deployment, or are these mock-ups meant to deceive? Every new frame raises questions like these, even as it answers old mysteries. Within weeks, President Eisenhower and President-elect John F. Kennedy are quietly briefed on these game-changing findings. The imagined Soviet juggernaut turns out to be a more modest and measurable than force. Inflated intelligence estimates are swiftly rewritten. U.S. Air Force generals who had scoffed at space cameras now fall silent, astonished by this trove of hard data. A new era of reconnaissance has dawned with these first images. From now on, secrets aren't what someone claims. They are what the camera captures on film. And the revelations of those first reels are only the beginning. How you read an airfield, from space photographs from 160 kilometers up, don't come with labels. The magic is in the measurement. Very quickly, U.S. intelligence analysts become expert at reading the geometry of Soviet bases. First, they measure runways. On a photo, a runway appears as a pale strip cutting across the terrain, and the interpreters can calculate its length using the image scale. If an airstrip is around 3,000 meters long, about 10,000 feet, and extra wide, it's almost certainly a strategic bomber base. After all, a fully loaded 295 Bear bomber needs roughly 2,500 meters to take off. A 3,000-meter runway gives heavy nuclear-armed bombers plenty of room to operate. In contrast, a short 200-meter strip, around 4,000 feet carved out of a forest, could only handle light fighters or transports, not a global threat. By checking runway length, width, and surface type, concrete versus dirt, photo interpreters can classify an airfield's purpose at a glance. Next, they look at revetments and hangars. A revetment is a blast wall bay or berm used to park and shield aircraft on the ground. In satellite photos, revetments show up as U-shaped or circular earthworks along the edges of the tarmac. If analysts count, say, 40 revetment hardstands, each roughly 9 meters, 30 feet across, they infer the base can house about 40 combat planes. It's simple arithmetic. Every revetment likely shelters one aircraft. Are those revetments occupied? Sometimes the camera catches the telltale outline of a MiG fighter's nose or a bomber's tail protruding from a bay. If many revetments are empty, it might mean the squadron is deployed elsewhere or that the airfield is being kept in reserve. Large hangars are another clue. For example, a hangar 50 meters wide could hide a bomber with a 45-meter wingspan. If a cluster of new big hangars is under construction, it hints that new and larger aircraft are expected to arrive. Fuel storage and bomb depots provide further hints. Say an airfield has a farm of massive fuel tanks, each about 20 meters across, 66 feet. That's a huge amount of aviation fuel on hand, enough to keep a regiment of heavy bombers flying regular sorties. Analysts can estimate a tank's capacity from its size and gauge how many flights the fuel stockpile might support. Likewise, munitions bunkers, those earth-covered igloos near the perimeter, indicate stockpiles of bombs or missiles. A base with dozens of bunkers can arm a lot of planes for wartime operations. Even support infrastructure speaks volumes. A rail spur leading into the base or a large cluster of trucks suggest frequent resupply deliveries, and ground scarring on the runways matters too. Long black skid marks near the ends of the strip mean heavy aircraft have been practicing touch-and-go landings there, signaling active training. Reading an airfield from space often comes down to careful counting and comparing. One powerful example: analysts know a Yak-28 Brewer medium bomber has a wingspan of about 11 meters, 36 feet. On a clear Corona photo, they might spot a tiny dark speck on a runway that casts a 12-meter shadow, about 40 feet long, just the right size for a Yak-28. If they see 6 identical specks with similar shadows, the conclusion is straightforward. Probably 6 Brewer bombers are deployed at that base. They tally them, note their formation and positions, and move on to the next airstrip. In essence, each satellite image is a puzzle of scale and detail waiting to be solved. Piece by piece, frame by frame, the United States learns to read the Soviet order of battle with nothing more than a ruler, a magnifier, and a trained eye. A runway's length becomes a clue to an enemy's reach. A row of dark dots becomes a squadron of jets. With practice, an expert analyst can glance at a single photo and deduce the combat potential that lurks on that stretch of concrete. The math of Corona. In the intelligence world, numbers tell the story. Here are 6 hard data points from the Corona program, each with a plain English meaning behind it. 914 meters of film in the first successful mission. 1 Corona return capsule, August 1960, brought back more imagery of the Soviet Union than all U-2 spy flights had managed in 4 years. Volume of coverage became a strength rather than a limitation overnight. Orbital altitude, 160 km, 100 miles. Each satellite flew low enough for useful resolution, but high enough to be beyond the reach of Soviet air defenses. Circling Earth every 90 minutes, a Corona bird passed over the USSR roughly 16 times a day, peering down from far above any fighters or missiles' grasp. Ground resolution, 12 meter, 40 ft. At first, early Corona cameras could distinguish objects roughly the size of a city bus. That meant big items, a bomber, a large building, a naval ship, showed up clearly, though finer details were fuzzy. It wasn't as sharp as a U-2 plane's photography, but it was good enough to count the bombers on a runway. Improved resolution to 2 Mys 6 ft by 1963. By the second generation of Corona satellites, better film and optics had dramatically sharpened the images. A 2-meter object about 6 feet could be discerned from orbit. Smaller tactical aircraft, missile trailers, even trucks became identifiable from space. The blind spots in reconnaissance shrank considerably. Area scanned per mission, 4.3 million km, 1.65 million sqmi. A single Corona mission's cameras could map an enormous area. The very first successful flight in 1960 scanned a region roughly the size of India in just 1 day in orbit. Wide-angle lenses sacrificed some resolution for breadth, sweeping up huge swaths of terrain. This synoptic view meant analysts could spot new airfields or factories that U-2 planes had never reached. A true broad brush mapping of the USSR. Total missions, 1960-1972. 145 flights, 120 plus successful. What began as a 1-year experiment turned into a 12-year torrent of intelligence gathering. By the end, Corona satellites had flown 145 missions and returned 167 film buckets to Earth, containing over 610 kilometers of film, 2 million feet, and around 800,000 images. It was a sustained reconnaissance campaign, essentially a wartime-scale effort run in utter peacetime secrecy. Each of these numbers marks a revolution in how information could be gathered. The end result was an intelligence picture drawn not from guesses or worst-case hunches, but from measurements and concrete counts. Case study: one Soviet air district to grasp Corona's impact. Zoom in on a single region, the Soviet Far East Air Defense District around 1960-62. Before satellites, Western analysts had only sketchy ideas about this remote theater. They suspected a couple of Arctic bomber bases might exist in Chukotka, the part of Siberia closest to Alaska, but details were sparse and unconfirmed. Reports from the 1950s had hinted at a new airfield near Anadyr, and perhaps another at Mys Shmidta, Cape Schmidt on the Arctic coast, bases that could threaten the U.S. via a polar attack route. Yet no one in the West had ever seen these locations with certainty until Corona's roving eye came back with the proof. In October 1961, a Corona KH-4 satellite passes over the Bering Sea and catches the Anadyr Ugolny airfield in frame. The photograph reveals a stark new runway cutting across the tundra. Analysts measure it at roughly 3,200 meters long, about 10,500 feet. This is no small outpost landing strip. It's long enough for fully loaded intercontinental bombers. On the parking apron, tiny dark shapes are lined up. When the image is enlarged through a stereoscope, the analysts identify at least 8 Tu-95 Bear bombers by their distinctive swept wings and the twin shadow lines of their propellers. The Far East base that had been a rumor is now clearly catalogued as a nuclear strike airfield. Immediately, U.S. Pacific Command realizes that Soviet bombers are forward deployed within about 3,000 kilometers, 1,100 miles, of Seattle. Plans are quickly adjusted. More early warning radars and interceptor aircraft are positioned to cover the polar approach from Siberia. Further north along the Arctic coast, at Mys Shmidta, Corona finds another critical airbase etched into the frozen coastal plain by the Chukchi Sea. The imagery shows a single long runway, roughly 2,500 meters, 8,200 feet, and a cluster of aircraft parked on the ramp. Photo interpreters count a mix of medium jet bombers, likely Tu-16 Badgers on the order of 10 in total. Nearby are rows of fuel drums and tank farms indicating an active refueling depot. This base could serve as a forward refueling and staging point for bombers en route to U.S. targets over the pole. Armed with this knowledge, the U.S. Strategic Air Command refines its war plans. Now they know precisely where these Soviet bombers are based in Chukotka, and they can plan to neutralize them early if war ever comes. Corona doesn't just confirm expected threats. It also dispels phantom ones. Western intelligence had worried about a supposed mystery base deeper inland in the Far East that could hide dozens of long-range bombers out of sight. Satellites scoured the suspected coordinates and found nothing but endless forest and tundra. A few temporary landing strips appeared out there, but no secret strategic airbase materialized. At the same time, the satellites uncovered installations that analysts hadn't even considered. For example, near Vladivostok on the Soviet Pacific coast, one Corona frame revealed a previously unknown airfield complex dotted with over 40 fighter planes. That site might not threaten the continental U.S., but it certainly mattered to U.S. Navy planners watching the Western Pacific. The point is that in one region after another, space reconnaissance replaced guesswork with ground truth. The Far East Air District went from a blank spot on Allied maps to a richly annotated network of runways, aircraft counts, and coordinates. Before, analysts asked, how many bombers could the Soviets be hiding out there? After Corona, they could say, they have exactly 18 Bears and 31 Badgers in the Far East, and here's where they are. Knowledge became concrete. Countermeasures versus cadence. The Soviets are not oblivious to these prying eyes in the sky. As soon as they realize that American satellites are routinely snapping pictures of their territory, they scramble to deploy countermeasures. They try everything short of shooting the satellites down, a capability they won't master until years later. On the ground, deception and concealment become the tools to confront the unblinking eye in the sky. At some bomber bases, Soviet crews park fake aircraft on the tarmac, decoys made of wood and canvas shaped and painted to look like MiGs or bombers. From 160 kilometers high, a well-crafted dummy can cast a shadow that looks almost real. For a time, U.S. photo interpreters are indeed fooled, until they notice that those particular aircraft never move or change position between satellite passes. Camouflage nets are rolled out as well. The Soviets stretch giant camo mesh over sensitive installations, trying to break up their outline. A half-constructed missile site might be draped with netting to obscure its telltale shape. On film, it just looks like a dark, indistinct blur, foiling identification for a short while. Some crews even go so far as to paint fake runways or the silhouettes of planes on open ground, creating phantom airfields in paint and plywood to mislead the eye above. Another tactic is timing. Once Soviet intelligence figures out the predictable patterns of U.S. satellite orbits, their forces attempt to hide activity during known overpass windows. If they know an American spy satellite will be overhead at, say, 10 a.m. Moscow time, they'll delay towing a new prototype bomber out of its hangar until after it's passed. Missile convoys on the road are rescheduled for night movements. During major exercises, entire air regiments might disperse to secondary airstrips or stay under shelter when an orbiting camera is due overhead. In short, they try to operate in the gaps between the American photo coverage. But these tricks can only accomplish so much, because the United States soon plays the ultimate countermeasure, sheer cadence. The reconnaissance satellites just keep coming, mission after mission. In 1961, Corona launches are happening roughly once a month. By 1963-64, improved systems mean flights can be weekly or even more frequent, and newer satellites like the KH-7 Gambit join the effort with even sharper eyes. The Soviets simply cannot shut down their vast military machine every time a satellite swings by, not when it's happening almost daily. Their elaborate concealment efforts start to resemble a high-stakes shell game. Sometimes they do succeed in hiding something. A new aircraft model might avoid detection for a while by staying indoors, for example. But more often, persistence from above wins out. If one base hides under camouflage nets, analysts note the strange new blobs on the photo and schedule extra passes. Eventually, a gust of wind or a careless moment will leave something exposed. If decoy planes are deployed, careful study across multiple days reveals inconsistencies. For instance, those dummy planes might cast no long shadow at dawn, betraying their flat wooden nature. The cat-and-mouse game goes even further. The National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, learns to tweak satellite orbits and timing to keep the Soviets guessing. Just when Soviet crews think they know exactly when the next American eye is coming over, a Corona capsule might deorbit a day early and grab a surprise snapshot. In response, the Soviets practice camouflage regularly and pour resources into underground hangars and retractable roof shelters. But such measures are enormously expensive and, in the early 60s, not yet widespread. Meanwhile, the United States is turning space reconnaissance into a relentless drumbeat. Launches become so routine that by the mid-1960s, a new set of photographic eyes is overhead almost every week. As one Air Force officer quips, document says, "We had a new satellite sunrise every week over Russia. The eye in the sky never blinks." What doctrine and policy changed? Arrival of reliable satellite intelligence doesn't just fill in blanks on maps. It fundamentally shifts American military doctrine and national security policy. First and foremost, U.S. leaders no longer have to argue in the dark about Soviet capabilities. They don't need to rely on worst-case assumptions or politically charged estimates when hard evidence is available. Now they can literally drop a stack of aerial photographs on the briefing table and say, "This is what the enemy has, right here, in black and white." Military planning immediately becomes more rational. For example, that alarming 200 missile gap some feared in 1960 is quietly laid to rest by 1961. Armed with satellite proof that the Soviets have only a handful of ICBMs, the White House and Pentagon adjust their spending plans. Resources are reallocated away from chasing phantoms. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, now confident in the new data, cancels or scales back several expensive weapons programs that had been sold as answers to inflated Soviet threats. Why fund 10 new bomber wings when the Soviets clearly have only a handful of heavy bombers deployed? Why panic build fallout shelters for an imagined flood of warheads when the actual ICBM count is so limited? Strategy and budgets begin to reflect reality instead of rhetoric. Intelligence doctrine evolves as well. The creation of the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, in 1961 is a direct result of Corona's success, a new highly secret organization to coordinate all U.S. spy satellite operations. Overhead reconnaissance becomes institutionalized as a permanent pillar of national security, rather than just a crash project or a stopgap. The CIA, the Air Force, the Navy, all the players, come to expect satellite coverage for everything from arms treaty verification to daily battlefield updates. Indeed, verifying treaties becomes possible for the first time. By the end of the 1960s, when Washington and Moscow negotiate limits on nuclear arms, they include a crucial concept in the agreements: national technical means of verification. In plain language, each side agrees it can use its own satellites to watch the other as a legitimate way to monitor compliance. This tacit acceptance is revolutionary. A decade earlier, the USSR had called space spying illegal, and now it effectively acknowledges that orbiting eyes are fair play. Inference: the change happened because both superpowers eventually acquired satellites. But it started with Corona proving their worth. Voluntary. Strategy and contingency planning also shift. From we think the enemy might do X to we know the enemy can only do. The certainty provided by photographic proof allows far more concrete plans. U.S. Air Defense Command, for example, updates its war scenarios once it's clear exactly how many Soviet bomber routes exist and where those bombers originate. There's no need to guard against imaginary fleets coming over the pole when the satellites have revealed only a few Arctic bases. The Navy can adjust its submarine patrol zones. After satellites pinpoint new Soviet missile submarine pens on the Kola Peninsula. In Joint Chiefs meetings, there is noticeably less overestimation of Soviet strength, which in turn tones down the pressure for hair-trigger responses to every crisis. Even during the harrowing Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, this new certainty helped. U-2 spy planes provided the initial proof of missiles in Cuba, but throughout the standoff, Corona satellites kept watch on Soviet long-range forces back in Eurasia, confirming that no sudden surge of bomber or missile activity was occurring elsewhere. That assurance prevented worst-case paranoia in Washington at the tensest moment of the Cold War. Perhaps most importantly, a cultural change takes root in the intelligence community. Photographic evidence becomes king. Analysis must now be backed up by what the imagery actually shows. Estimates from informants or defectors are cross-checked against what overhead photos reveal. If a human spy reports a huge new factory complex, but the satellite image shows only a small warehouse, the image wins the argument. As an internal mantra goes, photos don't lie. Or, in the dry words of one veteran analyst, document says photos don't argue, they count. Each count is a fact that can drive decisions. How many bombers, how many silos, how many tanks. This philosophy of show me the pictures helps enable real arms control agreements. When both sides trust the counting method, they can agree on limits with confidence that cheating would be spotted. It also changes how wars are planned. By the late 60s, U.S. generals have detailed target folders built from satellite mosaics. No longer are they dropping bombs on aim points derived from sketchy reports. Now they have precise coordinates, and often even a crystal-clear photo of the target itself. In sum, Corona's legacy in doctrine and policy is a shift from fear of the unknown to management of the known. Secrecy in world affairs becomes just a bit less opaque. The Soviets, who once jeered that American space cameras would be useless, must now assume that all their major moves will be seen and counted. And the Americans, once groping blindly behind the closed borders of the USSR, now have a clear playbook of their adversaries' forces. Transparency, ironically imposed unilaterally from space, becomes a stabilizer in an otherwise unstable peace. Coda, late 1962. In a secure room in Washington, 3 U.S. intelligence officers huddle over a glowing light table. A long strip of Corona film lies pinned down under the glass, each frame a tiny window into the heart of the Soviet Union. They slowly move a magnifying loop across an image of an airfield deep in central Russia. There, the dark shapes of Tu-16 Badger bombers, 11 of them, clustered near a fuel depot. One officer notes the date on the frame and compares it to a photo of the same base taken 6 months earlier. 2 new bombers have appeared since then, The count at that airfield is up by 2. They quietly update the wall chart that lists Soviet bombers by base. This is how the Cold War is now waged, not by angry speeches or wild guesses, but by cold, hard counting. The room stays dim as they roll onto the next frame, and one truth shines clearly on that illuminated film strip. The Soviets can no longer hide the strength or weakness of their forces. The camera has become the ultimate inspector. Moscow once mocked the very idea of American eyes in orbit, but here on this light table the proof is undeniable. The image doesn't lie. The numbers are right there. Photos don't argue, they just count.